February 19, 1945. 8 miles of volcanic ash stretched before 70,000 American servicemen as their landing craft approached the beaches of Iwo Jima. The Japanese commanders, watching from reinforced positions carved deep into Mount Suribachi, believed they had prepared an impenetrable fortress. They could not have been more mistaken about what the next 36 days would reveal. Before we dive into this story, make sure to subscribe to the channel and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. It really helps support the channel. This is the account of how a small volcanic island became the stage for one of the most intense military operations in the Pacific, and how the words spoken in Japanese command bunkers revealed a transformation from confidence to something far more complex. Lieutenant General Tadamichi Kuribayashi stood in his command post, buried 40 feet beneath the island's surface, reviewing intelligence reports that had arrived from Tokyo 3 months earlier. The reports estimated American forces might attempt a landing with perhaps 30,000 troops. Kuribayashi had spent 16 months transforming Iwo Jima into what he called a fortress of tunnels, preparing 11 miles of interconnected passages that ran through the volcanic rock like veins through stone. He had positioned 21,000 defenders across the island, each one assigned to specific defensive positions with orders that reflected a doctrine never before implemented in the Pacific Campaign. The general had visited the United States twice before the conflict, once in 1928 and again in 1931. He had toured Detroit factories, observed American industrial capacity firsthand, and returned to Japan with observations that his superiors found uncomfortable. In letters to his wife, he had written about American production capabilities with a tone that bordered on reverence, describing assembly lines that produced automobiles at rates that seemed impossible to Japanese manufacturing standards. Now facing an American invasion force, those memories shaped his defensive strategy in ways that set Iwo Jima apart from every previous island engagement. The traditional Japanese defensive doctrine called for meeting invaders at the waterline, contesting every foot of beach with immediate counterattacks. Kuribayashi rejected this approach entirely. His orders to his commanders contained a phrase that would become legendary in military analysis. The defenders would remain hidden, allowing the Americans to land unopposed, then engage them from positions so deeply fortified that conventional tactics would prove insufficient. On the American side, Major General Harry Schmidt commanded the 5th Amphibious Corps, coordinating 3 Marine divisions for the assault. The 4th Marine Division approached from the southeast, the 5th from the southwest, and the 3rd remained in reserve aboard transport ships. Schmidt had reviewed aerial photographs showing an island approximately 8 square miles in total area, dominated by Mount Suribachi at the southern tip and a plateau region stretching northeast. Intelligence estimates suggested Japanese forces numbered around 13,000 troops. The actual number would prove significantly higher. Corporal James Bradley of the 5th Marine Division remembered the morning with crystalline clarity decades later. He was a Navy corpsman attached to Easy Company, 2nd Battalion 28th Marines. The transport ship carrying his unit had arrived in the waters off Iwo Jima before dawn, and as sunlight broke across the Pacific, the island emerged from darkness like a creature surfacing from deep water. The smell reached them first, a sulphurous odor that one Marine compared to entering a room where someone had struck too many matches. The volcanic activity that had formed the island still simmered beneath its surface, releasing gases through cracks in the rock that gave the entire landmass an atmosphere of geological unrest. The preparatory bombardment had lasted 3 days, the longest preliminary barrage in the Pacific theater to that point. Navy ships had fired more than 22,000 shells at the island, and carrier-based aircraft had dropped hundreds of tons of ordnance on suspected defensive positions. From the transport ships, the Marines watched explosions bloom across the black sand beaches like orange flowers opening and closing in rapid succession. The noise was continuous, a rolling thunder that made conversation impossible and left ears ringing even through protective gear. What the Americans could not see was happening in the tunnels below. Kuribayashi had ordered his artillery crews to remain absolutely silent during the bombardment, prohibiting any return fire that might reveal gun positions. This discipline was extraordinary, considering the psychological pressure of enduring 3 days of sustained attack without response. In the command bunker, communications officers logged damage reports from observation posts that maintained watch despite the bombardment. The reports revealed that much of the American fire was landing on dummy positions, carefully constructed to draw attention away from actual defensive works. At 08:30 hours, the first wave of landing craft began their approach to the beaches. The designated landing zones stretched across 3,000 yards of shoreline on the southeastern coast. The craft moved in neat lines, their formations maintained despite swells that reached 6 feet in height. Inside each craft, 40 Marines sat with equipment weighing upward of 80 pounds per man, including rifles, ammunition, rations, water, engineering tools, and personal effects. Many experienced severe seasickness during the approach, the combination of tension and motion creating physical distress that they endured in silence. Lieutenant Colonel Chandler Johnson, commanding the 2nd Battalion, 28th Marines, watched the beach grow larger from his position in a command craft. His battalion had drawn the assignment of securing Mount Suribachi, the most prominent terrain feature on the island, and the position from which Japanese observers could watch every American movement. Johnson had studied maps and photographs until he could close his eyes and visualize the terrain in 3 dimensions. The mountain rose 546 feet above sea level, its slopes too steep for vehicles in most places, honeycombed with caves that intelligence estimated numbered in the dozens. The actual number exceeded 300. The landing craft struck the beach at 09:02 hours. Marines poured out onto volcanic sand that had the consistency of fine gravel, black particles that shifted underfoot, and made every step require extra effort. Those first moments of the landing would be described thousands of times in after-action reports and personal accounts, always with a sense of bewilderment at what did not happen. There was no fire. The beaches remained silent except for the sound of engines and shouted orders. Men advanced inland, climbing the terraces of loose volcanic sand that rose in steep slopes away from the waterline, expecting at any moment the eruption of defensive fire that was the standard reception for amphibious assaults. In the command bunker, Kuribayashi watched reports arrive from his observation posts. His artillery officers requested permission to open fire. The general consulted his pocket watch, a gift from his time in the United States, and calculated the number of Americans now committed to the beaches. At 09:25 hours, with several thousand Marines inland and unable to retreat effectively through the deep sand, he gave the order that unleashed the defensive plan he had spent 16 months perfecting. Every artillery piece, mortar and machine gun on the island opened fire simultaneously. The beach became what witnesses described as a landscape, transformed into pure violence. Shells landed with such precision that it became clear the Japanese gunners had pre-sighted every yard of sand, had calculated exact ranges to specific points, and had waited for maximum American presence before engaging. The volcanic sand that had seemed merely an obstacle now revealed itself as a weapon in its own right, as explosions threw up clouds of black particles that obscured vision and filled lungs, while the fine consistency of the material prevented effective digging for cover. Corporal Bradley found himself pressed flat against a slight rise in the terrain, a fold in the sand perhaps 18 inches high, that provided the only protection within reach. Marines around him attempted to advance inland, to escape the beach where they presented clear targets, but the terraces of loose sand made movement exhaustingly slow. Men climbed 3 feet forward and slid 2 feet back with each step, their boots finding no purchase in material that flowed like water around their feet. The Japanese positions firing on the beaches were invisible. Kuribayashi's defensive works had been designed with concealment as the primary consideration. Gun ports were cut at ground level, often hidden behind rocks or vegetation that could be moved aside when firing and replaced immediately after. Artillery pieces were positioned in caves with multiple entrances, allowing crews to fire, retreat deep into the tunnel network, and emerge at different positions before counter-battery fire could arrive. Some positions were so well hidden that American forces would pass within yards without detecting them, only to receive fire from behind after moving forward. By noon on the first day, 30,000 Marines had landed on Iwo Jima. Casualties were mounting at rates that exceeded even the pessimistic projections made during planning. The Navy hospital ships offshore began receiving wounded at numbers that strained their capacity. Doctors and corpsmen worked in continuous shifts, treating injuries that ranged from minor wounds to trauma so severe that survival seemed impossible, yet occasionally occurred through combinations of immediate medical response and individual resilience. The assault on Mount Suribachi began that afternoon. Johnson's battalion advanced toward the mountain's base against resistance that seemed to come from the volcanic rock itself. Japanese defenders had converted natural caves into fortified positions, reinforcing them with concrete and steel, installing firing ports that commanded approaches from multiple angles. The Marines adapted tactics in real time, using flamethrowers and demolitions to neutralize positions one at a time, a process that measured progress in yards rather than miles and hours rather than minutes. Private First Class Ira Hayes, a Pima Indian from Arizona serving in Easy Company, moved forward with his unit toward a Japanese bunker that was preventing their advance. The structure was built into the mountainside, its walls formed from reinforced concrete several feet thick. Standard rifle fire had no effect. Hayes and 5 other Marines approached from different angles, while a flamethrower team moved into position. The flamethrower operator, a corporal from Texas whose name Hayes would remember for the rest of his life, advanced to within 20 yards of the bunker entrance before opening fire. The effect of the flamethrower on fortified positions was both immediate and psychologically devastating. The weapon projected ignited fuel that stuck to surfaces and burned at temperatures exceeding 2,000 degrees Fahrenheit. When the stream of fire entered the bunker, the Japanese defenders inside faced a choice between remaining in a position that had become uninhabitable or emerging into rifle fire. Most chose the former. The bunker fell silent. Hayes's squad moved forward to the next position. In Tokyo, Imperial General Headquarters received their first detailed reports of the American landing during the evening of February 19th. The cable from Kuribayashi's communications officer provided troop strength estimates that caused immediate concern among senior commanders. 70,000 Americans represented a force 3 times larger than the defenders, a ratio that military doctrine suggested made successful defense nearly impossible. What the report did not convey was Kuribayashi's confidence that his defensive preparations would transform traditional calculations about numerical advantage. Admiral Ichimaro Toyoda, Chief of the Naval General Staff, read the report in his office overlooking Tokyo. His response, recorded in staff meeting minutes, reflected the strategic reality facing Japan in early 1945. He stated that Iwo Jima could not be reinforced, that the American Navy controlled the waters surrounding the island absolutely, and that Kuribayashi's garrison would receive no support beyond what they currently possessed. The words he used, translated from the original Japanese, were that the defenders would be required to demonstrate the spirit that had sustained Japan through centuries of challenges. This phrasing, carefully diplomatic, concealed a darker reality that everyone in the room understood. Iwo Jima's defenders were expected to perish. Their mission was not to win, but to delay, to extract the maximum cost in American lives and resources for every yard of volcanic rock. The hope was that such costs, accumulated across multiple island defenses, would eventually persuade American political leadership that continuing the advance toward Japan itself was unsustainable. On Iwo Jima, the reality of this strategic vision manifested in combat that continued through the night of February 19th and into the following days without pause. Japanese doctrine had traditionally included nighttime counterattacks, massed charges designed to overwhelm American positions in darkness when superior firepower was less effective. Kuribayashi forbade such attacks. His orders required defenders to remain in their fortified positions, to preserve their lives and ammunition for sustained defensive operations, rather than sacrificing them in dramatic but ultimately futile gestures. This represented a profound shift in Japanese military culture. The concept of death before surrender had been central to training and indoctrination, creating expectations among both Japanese troops and American forces that encounters would continue until one side was completely destroyed. Kuribayashi's approach, valued survival in service of continued resistance. He wanted his troops alive and fighting for as long as possible, not dead in glorious but strategically meaningless charges. The first flag raising on Mount Suribachi occurred on February 23rd, 4 days after the initial landing. A patrol from Easy Company reached the summit after hours of climbing and close combat against positions that defended every approach to the peak. Lieutenant Harold Schreier led the 40-man patrol, carrying a small American flag that had been obtained from a ship offshore. When the flag went up, attached to a length of pipe found among the debris on the summit, Marines across the island and sailors on ships offshore could see it. The reaction was immediate and emotional, cheers rising from thousands of throats despite ongoing combat that continued without pause around the island's perimeter. The famous photograph, the one that would become the most reproduced image in photographic history, was actually of a second flag raising that occurred later the same day. The first flag was considered too small to be easily visible from distances across the island, so a larger flag was brought up, and a replacement raising was staged for photographers. 6 Marines participated in raising the second flag. 3 of them would not survive the battle. Joe Rosenthal, an Associated Press photographer, captured the image at 1/20th of a second exposure time using a speed graphic camera. He almost missed the shot entirely, turning at the last moment when he heard someone shout that the flag was going up. The photograph shows 6 figures straining against the weight of the flagpole, their bodies angled forward in unified effort, the flag beginning to catch the wind. Mount Suribachi's volcanic slopes visible in the background. The composition was accidental, a product of timing and position rather than artistic planning, yet it achieved a power that carefully staged photographs rarely capture. In the Japanese command bunker, news of the flag on Suribachi reached Kuribayashi through observation post reports. His response, recorded by communications officers, was pragmatic rather than emotional. He noted that the Americans now controlled the high ground at the southern end of the island, that Japanese artillery observers on the mountain were no longer available, and that defensive operations would need to adjust to this new reality. He did not speak of the symbolic significance of the flag, did not frame the loss in terms of morale or honor. His focus remained tactical, concerned with how to continue effective resistance with the resources and positions remaining available. The battle for Iwo Jima's northern plateau consumed the next 4 weeks. The terrain shifted from open beaches to broken ground, riddled with ravines, rocky outcroppings and vegetation that provided concealment. Japanese defensive positions in this region were even more elaborate than those at Suribachi, connected by tunnels that allowed defenders to move beneath American lines, to appear in areas thought secure, to maintain resistance long after positions were officially considered captured. Sergeant Ernest Thomas of the 3rd Marine Division participated in the reduction of a position that illustrated the complexity of the Japanese defensive network. His platoon had advanced across what appeared to be undefended ground toward a ridge line that offered good observation of the surrounding area. As they approached the ridge, fire erupted from positions to their rear. From ground they had crossed minutes earlier. Japanese troops had allowed the Marines to pass over concealed tunnel entrances, then emerged behind them, creating a situation where the Americans were caught between positions in front and behind. The solution required coordination between multiple units, with some Marines maintaining suppressive fire on known positions, while others swept back across ground already covered, locating and neutralizing the hidden entrances. The process took 7 hours and cost 14 casualties. When finally completed, investigation of the tunnel system revealed it extended more than 300 yards, connected 5 separate defensive positions, and included living quarters, ammunition storage, and a small medical station. The engineering work involved was extraordinary, all of it accomplished with hand tools in volcanic rock, without heavy machinery or powered equipment. By early March, American casualties exceeded 15,000, including more than 3,000 fatalities. These numbers prompted discussions at the highest levels of American command about whether Iwo Jima's strategic value justified the cost being paid to secure it. The island's airfields were the primary objective, 3 strips that would allow damaged bombers returning from raids on Japan to make emergency landings, rather than attempting to reach bases in the Mariana Islands, hundreds of miles farther south. Projections suggested that access to Iwo Jima would save hundreds of aircrew lives over the remaining months of the campaign. Whether these projected savings balanced against actual casualties being sustained in the ground combat remained a subject of intense debate. In Washington, Secretary of the Navy James Forrestal visited Iwo Jima on February 23rd, arriving aboard ship to observe the operation firsthand. His reaction to the scale of the combat, recorded in his personal diary, expressed shock at the intensity of fighting and concern about the cumulative impact of such operations on American forces and public support. He noted that this was the first operation in the Pacific where American casualties exceeded Japanese casualties, a result of the defensive approach Kuribayashi had implemented. Kuribayashi himself maintained communication with Tokyo through sporadic radio transmissions that evaded American monitoring efforts. His messages during mid-March conveyed increasing difficulty maintaining organized resistance, noting that American forces had divided the island into sections and were systematically clearing each area, that supplies were critically depleted, particularly water and medical materials, and that casualties among his garrison had reduced effective combat strength by more than half. Despite these realities, he reported continued determination to resist and extracted promises from his remaining troops that they would continue fighting regardless of circumstances. The final organized Japanese position was overrun on March 26, 1945. The official declaration that the island was secured came on that date, although isolated pockets of resistance would continue for weeks afterward. Some Japanese soldiers, unable or unwilling to surrender, remained hidden in caves, emerging occasionally to scavenge supplies or to engage in small-scale attacks before retreating underground. The last 2 Japanese soldiers to emerge from hiding on Iwo Jima did so in 1949, 4 years after the battle's conclusion, unaware or unwilling to accept that the broader conflict had ended. The final casualty count for the American forces exceeded 26,000, including more than 6,800 fatalities. The Japanese garrison of 21,000 defenders suffered casualties approaching 100%, with only slightly more than 200 taken prisoner. Most of those who became prisoners were wounded men unable to resist capture, rather than individuals who voluntarily surrendered. The ratio of casualties to total forces engaged made Iwo Jima one of the costliest battles in United States military history when measured by percentage of forces that became casualties. Kuribayashi's fate remained uncertain for decades. American intelligence officers reported that his body was never positively identified among the thousands of Japanese dead. Some accounts suggested he led a final attack on American positions during the last days of organized resistance, perishing in that action. Others indicated he might have taken his own life in accordance with military tradition. Japanese sources eventually concluded that he most likely perished on March 26 during the final collapse of organized defense, though the exact circumstances remained undocumented. The strategic value of Iwo Jima became apparent in the months following its capture. The first emergency landing by a damaged bomber occurred on March 4th, while fighting still raged in the northern portion of the island. The aircraft, a B-29 superfortress named Dynamite, had sustained damage during a raid on Tokyo and could not maintain altitude sufficient to reach the Marianas. The crew diverted to Iwo Jima's partially repaired airfield, landing successfully and allowing all 11 crew members to survive what would otherwise have been a fatal situation. By August 1945, more than 2,400 emergency landings had occurred on Iwo Jima, preserving the lives of approximately 27,000 air crew members. These numbers validated the strategic rationale for capturing the island, though they could not resolve the moral complexity of whether such projections justified the immediate cost paid by the assault forces. The Japanese High Command's assessment of Iwo Jima, compiled in the months following the battle's conclusion, acknowledged that Kuribayashi's defensive approach had achieved its objective of maximizing American casualties while minimizing the speed of their advance. Staff officers calculated that the Americans had required 36 days to secure 8 square miles of territory, an average of less than 1/4 of a square mile per day. This rate of advance was dramatically slower than previous island campaigns, suggesting that Kuribayashi's tactics represented a more effective approach to defensive operations than traditional doctrines. However, the assessment also concluded that such defensive successes were ultimately futile given the broader strategic situation. Japan's industrial capacity could not replace losses in manpower and material at rates approaching American production capabilities. Every defensive success was, at best, a delay rather than a reversal of strategic momentum. The officers who compiled the assessment used careful language to avoid direct criticism of national policy, but their conclusion was clear to informed readers. The conflict's outcome was mathematically determined by industrial capacity, and no amount of tactical innovation or individual courage could overcome that fundamental disparity. In the decades following the conflict, military historians analyzed Iwo Jima as a case study in defensive operations. Kuribayashi's approach influenced defensive doctrine in numerous armies, demonstrating that properly prepared positions defended by disciplined troops could exact tremendous costs on attacking forces even when outnumbered and without hope of reinforcement or relief. The battle also illustrated the limitations of such defenses, showing that determined attackers with superior resources would eventually prevail regardless of defensive sophistication. The island itself was returned to Japanese administration in 1968. Today it remains largely uninhabited except for military personnel operating a small self-defense force facility. The beaches where 70,000 Americans landed in February 1945 are accessible only by special permission. The volcanic sand still black, the terraces still steep. The tunnels where Kuribayashi's garrison made their final stand remain largely unexplored. Too dangerous to enter without extensive preparation and too numerous to investigate comprehensively. Mount Suribachi still dominates the southern horizon, its slopes marked by memorial plaques and monuments placed by veterans groups from both sides. The summit where Easy Company raised the flags is accessible by a hiking trail that winds through terrain still bearing the scars of combat. Visitors report a profound sense of solemnity when standing at the location where Joe Rosenthal captured his famous photograph, looking out over an island that absorbed so much determination and sacrifice in such a compressed period. The words spoken in Japanese command bunkers during those 36 days reveal a military culture in transition, struggling to reconcile traditional values with modern strategic realities. Kuribayashi's pragmatic approach represented a shift away from ritualized concepts of honor toward calculated attempts to maximize effectiveness within impossible situations. His communications with Tokyo show a commander focused on concrete objectives rather than symbolic gestures, willing to abandon doctrines that served morale rather than strategic purpose. Yet that pragmatism could not overcome the fundamental disparity in resources. American industrial capacity produced replacement equipment and supplies at rates that Japanese planners found incomprehensible. When ammunition was expended, more arrived within days. When aircraft were damaged, replacements appeared almost immediately. The Marines on Iwo Jima fought with the confidence that came from knowing their material needs would be met, that medical care was available for the wounded, that reinforcements could be requested and would actually arrive. Japanese defenders fought with the knowledge that what they possessed on February 19th was all they would ever have, that every round of ammunition expended could not be replaced, that wounded comrades would receive only the most basic care with dwindling supplies, and that no reinforcement was possible. The psychological impact of this disparity was as significant as the material reality, creating fundamentally different mental states between attackers and defenders. The transformation revealed through this battle was not in the outcome, which was never seriously in doubt once American forces committed to the operation, but in the cost extracted for that predetermined result. Kuribayashi demonstrated that even doomed defenses could achieve tactical successes that resonated far beyond the immediate battlefield. The casualties sustained on Iwo Jima influenced American planning for subsequent operations, contributing to assessments that invasion of Japan itself would require resources and accept casualties on scales that political leadership found unacceptable. Whether this influenced the decision to use atomic weapons against Hiroshima and Nagasaki remains a subject of historical debate, but Iwo Jima certainly contributed to the calculations that informed that choice. The battle provided concrete data about what could be expected when defending forces were properly prepared, deeply entrenched, and determined to resist to the point of annihilation. Extrapolating those conditions to the Japanese home islands produced casualty projections that numbered in the hundreds of thousands. And that concludes our story. If you made it this far, please share your thoughts in the comments. What part of this historical account surprised you most? Don't forget to subscribe for more untold stories from World War II and check out the video on screen for another incredible tale from history. Until next time.